Hi there, I'm Dr. Jonathan Denny, and this is Inside Interpreting, and we're here for the second video on the series on an interpreting future. Last time we looked at how people would discover interpreting and what role interpreting will play in society as a whole. Now, it's all well and good talking about the need for interpreting and talking about the important place that human beings will play in interpreting, but how will people become interpreters in the first place? And once they've become interpreters, how will they keep getting better at their interpreting? There's no point just qualifying and then going, and not bothering to do anything else in the rest of your career to work on your skills. So today I want to talk about a subject for which I am not qualified. And again, I want to reiterate that these videos and the blog post linked to in the comments are about starting discussion. I'm not claiming to be an authority in any of these subjects. I'm simply throwing out some ideas for us to discuss. So what does the future of interpreter training and teaching look like? Well, I want to focus a little bit on the university side of things because I was trained at a university, and many interpreters go through the university system or sometimes the technical college system to get trained. And so, like a good interpreter trainer or a good academic, I have a PowerPoint slide, and look, the first page has a grammar error in it. Can't be helped. So, I'm not an expert, but like all academics, I like to use titles with colons in them. So, some thoughts on teaching interpreting in the future. And here I'm specifically thinking about within the university context, but a lot of this applies to continued professional development as well. Oh, pretty picture. Yeah, see, this is the thing. We end up caught on the methods and the medium, and we forget that actually content is king. So before I go anywhere else, I want to say that interpreter trainers of all levels are amazing. Anyone who can continue to teach interpreting during a pandemic deserves a gold star. So give yourself a clap already, a real pat on the back for those who continue to teach interpreting through the pandemic. And I think any criticisms of how university teachers and lecturers have managed through the pandemic and how trainers have managed through the pandemic is really silly, because this is the first time that anyone lived through a pandemic and people had to really adjust their training methods and adjust their technologies to suit. So I'm not criticising any interpreter trainers or people who provide CPD here. I just want to throw out some ideas, and some of them you've probably thought of already. I just want to highlight them. And so one thing I wanted to say is that the world is changing, and anyone currently trying to teach interpreting in any form, whether it's through a CPD class, whether it's through teaching people technology, whether it's through teaching on a university or a college course, we must all be exhausted. I know I'm exhausted, and all I've been doing is guest lectures and plenary talks and conference talks. It's exhausting trying to find new creative ways to teach and train interpreting during a pandemic. So let's start from there. The second thing I would say is that outside of sign language interpreting, interpreter training tends to be split into settings like medical interpreting, conference interpreting, court interpreting, public service interpreting, community interpreting, and so on. That makes a lot of sense in a world where those settings exist. That makes a lot of sense where interpreters aren't going to go between different settings, and it makes a lot of sense where there's a massive difference in how interpreters work between those settings. But during a pandemic, and even afterwards, where all interpreters are using some sort of remote interpreting technology now, does this kind of silo thinking make any sense at all? Does it make sense to continue to split interpreters up according to these settings, or should we be thinking about how we can bring them together? In Heriot-Watt University, where I did my Masters and my PhD, they trained sign language interpreters and conference interpreters in the same department. When they have their multilingual debate at the end of the year, the sign language interpreters and the spoken language conference interpreters are there together. It makes sense to break down the walls between different interpreting settings, because interpreters in different settings do very similar work at times, but get paid very differently. And certainly the methods of training in the UK are different in the different settings. Does that make any sense where increasingly we're all using very similar skills and very similar technologies? So imagine interpreter training like this. Imagine there was a core skills year, so a year where all interpreters of all stripes are learning together. They might be separated into their own language courses at different times, but the majority of the time they're all together. And then you follow up that core skills year for the skills that every interpreter needs for specific training for different domains, not settings, not court interpreting or medical interpreting or community interpreting or court interpreting, but training in different domains of knowledge like business, politics, medicine, law, manufacturing, religion, and so on. I'm increasingly seeing that interpreters are going to need to specialise by domain, just like translators have for a long time. Translators are manufacturing translators or legal translators or medical translators, or they are translators for tourism or translators for something else, and they specialise by domain. There's no suggestion that a translator who translates manuals is an entirely different profession to someone who translates tourism literature. There's a recognition that they're all doing a common profession. They may do it in different domains and with different kinds of clients, but the profession is the same. Now, someone asked me about this. They said, well, you're saying we shouldn't be medical interpreters and legal interpreters or court interpreters, but we should specialise in medicine and in law. What's the difference? Well, the difference is very clear to me. If you're an interpreter specialised in medicine, then you might indeed work in a hospital or in a doctor's surgery, but you might also work at medical conferences. You might also work at medical training sessions. Your specialism then is medicine, or perhaps an area of medicine. But within medicine, you can do any kind of interpreting that domain needs. The same with law. If you're an interpreter in law, you might be able to do court settings, you might be able to do police interviews, but you might also be able to do legal research conferences. Instead of thinking about settings in terms of the modes we use and where we work, let's think about different domains in which interpreters work. Now, that asks another question. Who can teach all this specialist stuff? Because most interpreters that I know, especially conference interpreters, are used to doing nuclear power and carbon fibre and all sorts of conferences in all sorts of areas. Who could teach that when interpreters, certainly conference interpreters, tend not to specialise now? Well, what about building more partnerships with the places that the interpreters will be working in? We've already seen that with the international institutions, sending people to teach about interpreting in those institutions, or having partnerships with universities. What about if universities manage to do that with manufacturing companies or exporting companies or lawyer offices? Could partnerships be built between interpreting schools and other areas of the economy? So who else needs to be in the classroom? If you're training interpreters who are going to be working in law, then is it possible to bring legal experts and researchers and lawyers into the classroom? I've seen some wonderful ideas where people have been training doctors and medical interpreters together. That's a really good idea. If we're training interpreters who we know are increasingly going to be freelancing on the commercial market, do we need to look at our local business bureaus, our local business development bureaus, or export offices, or institutes for other things, and bring those people into the classroom too? To explain to interpreters, what does it look like when you're doing an international business negotiation? Maybe bring people in from the event sector and talk about what it looks like to set up an international conference and the place that interpreting plays in that. What role does interpreting have in an international conference or in a big event? Now, I realise that some of this might be impossible. Universities tend not to change very quickly. Once a course is approved, it's very difficult to change it afterwards. But if you're running continued professional development events, I want to ask you to, instead of thinking about saying this is an event for conference interpreters or this is a training group for conference interpreters, think about the skills or the domain that you're working in. So instead of saying this is a conference interpreter practice group, what about saying this is a practice group working on simultaneous interpreting? Instead of saying this is an event for medical interpreters, start thinking about this is an event training interpreters in this area of medicine. Can we think beyond the settings that we've already had and adjust how we write and how we sell and market the training that we offer to train future interpreters together? I'm Dr. Jonathan Downey, this is Inside Interpreting, and I'll see you next time.